It began with "Ah, si tu savais," and every verse ended with "si tu savais." Robert's voice was not pretentious. It was musical and true. The voice, the notes, the whole refrain haunted her memory. Chapter 15. When Edna entered the dining room one evening, a little late, as was her habit, an unusually animated conversation seemed to be going on. Several persons were talking at once, and Victor's voice was predominating, even over that of his mother. Edna had returned late from her bath, had dressed in some haste, and her face was flushed. Her head, set off by her dainty white gown, suggested a rich, rare blossom. She took her seat at table, between old Monsieur Farival and Madame Ratignolle. As she seated herself and was about to begin to eat her soup, which had been served when she entered the room, several persons informed her simultaneously that Robert was going to Mexico. She laid her spoon down and looked about her, bewildered. He had been with her, reading to her all the morning, and had never even mentioned such a place as Mexico. She had not seen him during the afternoon. She had heard someone say he was at the house, upstairs with his mother. This she had thought nothing of, though she was surprised when he did not join her later in the afternoon, when she went down to the beach. She looked across at him where he sat beside Madame Lebrun, who presided. Edna's face was a blank picture of bewilderment, which she never thought of disguising. He lifted his eyebrows, with the pretext of a smile, as he returned her glance. He looked embarrassed and uneasy. When is he going? If she asked of everybody, in general, as if Robert were not there to answer for himself. Tonight. This very evening. Did you ever? What possesses him? Were some of the replies she gathered uttered simultaneously in French and English. Impossible, she exclaimed. How can a person start off from Grand Isle to Mexico at a moment's notice, as if he were going over to Klein's, or to the wharf, or down to the beach? I said all along I was going to Mexico. I've been saying so for years, cried Robert, in an excited and irritable tone, with the air of a man defending himself against a swarm of stinging insects. Madame Lebrun knocked on the table with her knife handle. Please let Robert explain why he is going and why he is going tonight, she called out. Really, this table is getting to be more and more like Bedlam every day, with everybody talking at once. Sometimes I hope God will forgive me, but positively, sometimes I wish Victor would lose the power of speech. Victor laughed sardonically as he thanked his mother for her holy wish, of which he failed to see the benefit to anybody, except that it might afford her a more ample opportunity and license to talk herself. Monsieur Farival thought that Victor should have been taken out in mid-ocean, in his earliest youth, and drowned. Victor thought there would be more logic in thus disposing of old people with an established claim for making themselves universally obnoxious. Madame Lebrun grew a trifle hysterical. Robert called his brother some sharp, hard names. There's nothing much to explain, mother, he said. Louis explained, nevertheless, looking chiefly at Edna, that he could only meet the gentleman whom he intended to join at Vera Cruz by taking such and such a steamer. But when did you make up your mind to all this? Demanded Monsieur Farival. This afternoon, returned Robert with a shade of annoyance. At what time? This afternoon, persisted the old gentleman, with nagging determination, as if he were cross-questioning a criminal in a court of justice. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, Monsieur Farival, Robert replied, in a high voice and with a lofty air, which reminded Edna of some gentleman on the stage. She had forced herself to eat most of her soup, and now she was picking the flaky bits of her court bouillon with her fork. The lovers were profiting by the general conversation on Mexico to speak in whispers of matters which they rightly considered were interesting to no one but themselves. The lady in black had once received a pair of prayer beads of curious workmanship from Mexico, with very special indulgence attached to them, but she had never been able to ascertain whether the indulgence extended outside the Mexican border. Father Frokel of the cathedral had attempted to explain it, but he had not done so to her satisfaction, and she begged that Robert would interest himself and discover, if possible, whether she was entitled to the indulgence accompanying the remarkably curious Mexican prayer beads. Madame Ratignolle hoped that Robert would exercise extreme caution in dealing with the Mexicans, who she considered were a treacherous people, unscrupulous and revengeful. She trusted she did them no injustice in, thus condemning them as a race. She had known personally but one Mexican who made and sold excellent tamales, and whom she would have trusted implicitly, so soft-spoken was he. One day, he was arrested for stabbing his wife. She never knew whether he had been hanged or not. Victor had grown hilarious and was attempting to tell an anecdote about a Mexican girl who served chocolate one winter in a restaurant in Dauphine Street. No one would listen to him, but old Monsieur Farival, who went into convulsions over the droll story. Edna wondered if they had all gone mad to be talking and clamoring at that rate. She herself could think of nothing to say about Mexico or the Mexicans. "At what time do you leave?" she asked Robert. "At 10, he told her. "Beaudelet wants to wait for the moon. Are you all ready to go?" "Quite ready. I shall only take a handbag, and shall pack my trunk in the city." He turned to answer some question put to him by his mother, and Edna, having finished her black coffee, left the table. She went directly to her room. The little cottage was close and stuffy after leaving the outer air, but she did not mind. There appeared to be 100 different things demanding her attention indoors. She began to set the toilet stand to rights, grumbling at the negligence of the quadroon, who was in the adjoining room, putting the children to bed. She gathered together stray garments that were hanging on the backs of chairs and put each where it belonged in closet or bureau drawer. She changed her gown for a more comfortable and commodious wrapper. She rearranged her hair, combing and brushing it with unusual energy. Then she went in and assisted the quadroon in getting the boys to bed. They were very playful and inclined to talk, to do anything but lie quiet and go to sleep. Edna sent the quadroon away to her supper and told her she need not return. Then she sat and told the children a story. Instead of soothing, it excited them and added to their wakefulness. She left them in heated argument, speculating about the conclusion of the tale, which their mother promised to finish the following night. The little black girl came in to say that Madame Lebrun would like to have Mrs. Pontellier go and sit with them over the house till Mr. Robert went away. Edna returned answer that she had already undressed, that she did not feel quite well, but perhaps she would go over to the house later. She started to dress again and got as far advanced as to remove her peignoir. The change in her mind once more, she resumed the peignoir and went outside and sat down before her door. She was overheated and irritable and fanned herself energetically for a while. Madame Radinoy came down to discover what was the matter. "All that noise and confusion at the table must have upset me," replied Edna, "and moreover, I hate shocks and surprises." The idea of Robert starting off in such a ridiculously sudden, dramatic way, as if it were a matter of life and death, never saying a word about it all morning, when he was with me. Yes, agreed, Madame Ratignolle. I think it was showing us all, you especially, very little consideration. It wouldn't have surprised me in any of the others. Those Lebrun are all given to heroics. But I must say, I should never have expected such a thing from Robert. Are you not coming down? Come on, dear. It doesn't look friendly. No, said Edna, a little sullenly. I can't go to the trouble of dressing again. I don't feel like it. You needn't dress. You look all right. Fasten a belt around your waist. Just look at me. No, persisted Edna, but you go on. Madame Lebrun might be offended if we both stayed away. Madame Ratignolle kissed Edna goodnight and went away, being in truth rather desirous of joining in the general and animated conversation, which was still in progress concerning Mexico and the Mexicans. Somewhat later, Robert came up, carrying his handbag. Aren't you feeling well? He asked. Oh, well enough. Are you going right away? He lit a match and looked at his watch. In 20 minutes, he said. The sudden and brief flare of the match emphasized the darkness for a while. He sat down upon a stool which the children had left out on the porch. Get a chair, said Edna. This will do, he replied. He put on his soft hat and nervously took it off again, and wiping his face with his handkerchief, complained of the heat. Take the fan, said Edna, offering it to him. Oh, no. Thank you. It does no good. You have to stop fanning some time and feel all the more uncomfortable afterward. 135,000. That's one of the ridiculous things which men always say. So I have never known one to speak otherwise of fanning. How long will you be gone? Forever, perhaps. I don't know. It depends upon a good many things. Well, in case it shouldn't be forever, how long will it be? I don't know. This seems to me perfectly preposterous and uncalled for. I don't like it. I don't understand your motive for silence and mystery, never saying a word to me about it. He remained silent, not offering to defend himself. He only said, after a moment, don't part from me in any ill humor. I never knew you to be out of patience with me before. I don't want to part in any ill humor, she said. But can't you understand? I've grown used to seeing you, to having you with me all the time, and your action seems unfriendly, even unkind. You don't even offer an excuse for it. Why, I was planning to be together, thinking of how pleasant it would be to see you in the city next winter. So was I, he blurted. Perhaps that's the... He stood up suddenly and held out his hand. Goodbye, my dear Mrs. Pontellier. Goodbye. You won't. I hope you won't completely forget me. She clung to his hand, striving to detain him. Write to me when you get there, won't you, Robert? She entreated. I will. Thank you. Goodbye. How unlike Robert. The merest acquaintance would have said something more emphatic than I will. Thank you. Goodbye. To such a request, he had evidently already taken leave of the people over at the house, for he descended the steps and went to join Baudelaire, who was out there with an oar across his shoulder, waiting for Robert. They walked away in the darkness. She could only hear Baudelaire's voice. Robert had apparently not even spoken a word of greeting to his companion. Edna bit her handkerchief convulsively, striving to hold back and to hide, even from herself as she would have hidden from another, the emotion which was troubling, tearing her. Her eyes were brimming with tears. For the first time, she recognized the symptoms of infatuation, which she had felt incipiently as a child, as a girl in her earliest teens, and later, as a young woman. The recognition did not lessen the reality, the poignancy of the revelation, by any suggestion or promise of instability. The past was nothing to her, offered no lesson which she was willing to heed. The future was a mystery which she never attempted to penetrate. The present alone was significant, was hers to torture her as it was doing now. With the biting tension she had lost that which she had held, that she had been denied that which her impassioned, newly awakened. Chapter 16. Do you miss your friend greatly? Asked Mademoiselle Reisz one morning, as she came creeping up behind Edna, who had just left her cottage on her way to the beach. She spent much of her time in the water since she had acquired finally the art of swimming. As their stay at Grand Isle drew near its close, she felt that she could not give too much time to a diversion, which afforded her the only real, pleasurable moments that she knew. When Mademoiselle Reisz came and touched her upon the shoulder and spoke to her, the woman seemed to echo the thought which was ever in Edna's mind, or, better, the feeling which constantly possessed her. Robert's going had some way taken the brightness, the color, the meaning out of everything. The conditions of her life were in no way changed, but her whole existence was dulled, like a faded garment which seems to be no longer worth wearing. She sought him everywhere, in others seemed induced to talk about him. She went up, in the mornings, to Madame Lebrun's room, braving the clatter of the old sewing machine. She sat there and chatted at intervals, as Robert had done. She gazed around the room at the pictures and photographs hanging upon the wall and discovered in some corner an old family album, which she examined with the keenest interest, appealing to Madame Lebrun for enlightenment concerning the many figures and faces which she discovered between its pages. There was a picture of Madame Lebrun with Robert as a baby, seated in her lap, a round-faced infant with a fist in his mouth. The eyes alone in the baby suggested the man. And that was, he also in kilts, at the age of 5, wearing long curls and holding a whip in his hand. It made Edna laugh, and she laughed too, at the portrait in his first long trousers, while another interested her, taken when he left for college, looking thin, long-faced, with eyes full of fire, ambition, and great intentions. But there was no recent picture. None which suggested the Robert who had gone away 5 days ago, leaving a void and wilderness behind him. Oh, Robert stopped having his pictures taken when he had to pay for them himself. He found wiser use for his money, he says, explained. She had a letter from him, written before he left New Orleans. Edna wished to see the letter, and Madame Lebrun told her to look for it either on the table or the dresser, or perhaps it was on a mantelpiece. The letter was on the bookshelf. It possessed the greatest interest and attraction for Edna. The envelope, its size and shape, the postmark, the handwriting. She examined every detail of the outside before opening it. There were only a few lines setting forth that he would leave the city that afternoon, that he had packed his trunk in good shape, that he was well and sent her his letter, and begged to be affectionately remembered to all. There was no special message to Edna except a postscript, saying that if Mrs. Pontellier desired to finish the book, which he had been reading to her, his mother would find it in his room, among other books there on the table. Edmund experienced a pang of jealousy, because he had written to his mother rather than to her. Everyone seemed to take for granted that she missed him. Even her husband, when he came down the Saturday following Robert's departure, expressed regret that he had gone. "How do you get on without him, Edna?" they asked. "It's very dull without him," she admitted. Mr. Pontellier had seen Robert in the city, and Edna asked him a dozen questions or more. Where had they met? On Carondelet Street in the morning. They had gone in and had a drink and cigar together. What had they talked about? Chiefly about his prospects in Mexico, which Mr. Pontellier thought were promising. How did he look? How did he seem, grave or gay? Or how? Quite cheerful, and wholly taken up with the idea of his trip, which Mr. Pontellier found altogether natural in a young fellow about to seek fortune and adventure in a strange, queer country. At Edna tapped her foot impatiently and wondered why the children persisted in playing in the sun when they might be under the trees. She went down and led them out of the sun, scolding the quadroon for not being more attentive. It did not strike her as in the least grotesque that she should be making of Robert the object of conversation, and leading her husband to speak of him. The sentiment which she entertained for Robert in no way resembled that which she felt for her husband, or had ever felt or ever expected to feel. She had all her life long been accustomed to harbor thoughts and emotions which never voiced themselves. They had never taken the form of struggles. They belonged to her and were her own, and she entertained the conviction that she had a right to them, and that they concerned no one but herself. Edna had once told Madame Raquin that she would never sacrifice herself for her children, or for anyone. Then had followed a rather heated argument. The two women did not appear to understand each other, or to be talking the same language. Edna tried to appease her friend, to explain, "I would give up the unessential. I would give my money. I would give my life for my children, but I wouldn't give myself. I can't make it more clear. It's only something which I am beginning to comprehend, which is revealing itself to me." "I don't know what you would call the essential, or what you mean by the unessential," said Madame Matignon, cheerfully. "But a woman who would give her life for her children could do no more than that. Your Bible tells you so." "I'm sure I couldn't do more than that." "Oh, yes, you could," laughed Edna. She was not surprised at Mademoiselle Reisz's question. A morning that lady, following her to the beach, tapped her on the shoulder and asked if she did not greatly miss her young friend. "Oh, good morning, mademoiselle. Is it you?" "Why, of course I miss Robert." "Are you going down to bathe?" "Why should I go down to bathe at the very end of the season, when I haven't been in the surf all summer?" replied the woman, disagreeably. "I beg your pardon," offered Edna, in some embarrassment, for she should have remembered that Mademoiselle Reisz's avoidance of the water had furnished a theme for much pleasantry. Some among them thought it was on account of her false hair, or the dread of getting the violets wet, while others attributed it to the natural aversion for water sometimes believed to accompany the artistic temperament. Mademoiselle offered Edna some chocolates in a paper bag, which she took from her pocket, by way of showing that she bore no ill feeling. She habitually ate chocolates for their sustaining quality. They contained much nutriment in small compass, she said. They saved her from starvation, as Madame Lebrun's table was utterly impossible, and no one save so impertinent a woman as Madame Lebrun could think of offering such food to people and requiring them to pay for it. "She must feel very lonely without her son," said Edna, desiring to change the subject. "Her favorite son, too. It must have been quite hard to let him go." Mademoiselle laughed maliciously. "Her favorite son! Oh, dear! Who could have been imposing such a tale upon you? Aline Lebrun lives for Victor, and for Victor alone. She has spoiled him into the worthless creature he is. She worships him and the ground he walks on. Robert is very well, in a way, to give up all the money he can earn to the family, and keep the barest pittance for himself. Favorite son, indeed. I miss the poor fellow myself, my dear. I like to see him and to hear him about the place. The only Lebrun who is worth a pinch of salt. He comes to see me often in the city. I like to play to him. That Victor, hanging would be too good for him. It's a wonder Robert hasn't beaten him to death long ago." "I thought he had great patience with his brother," offered Edna, glad to be talking about Robert, no matter what was said. "Oh, he thrashed him well enough a year or two ago," said Mademoiselle, It was about a Spanish girl, who Victor considered that he had some sort of claim upon. He met Robert one day talking to the girl, or walking with her, or baiting with her, or carrying her basket. I don't remember what, and he became so insulting and abusive that Robert gave him a thrashing on the spot that has kept him comparatively in order for a good while. It's about time he was getting another. Was her name Mariakita? Asked Edna. Mariakita. Yes, that was it, Mariakita. I had forgotten. Oh, she's a sly one, and a bad one, that Mariakita. Edna looked down at Mademoiselle Reisz and wondered how she could have listened to her venom so long. For some reason she felt depressed, almost unhappy. She had not intended to go into the water, but she donned her bathing suit and left Mademoiselle alone, seated under the shade of the children's tent. The water was growing cooler as the season advanced. Edna plunged and swam about with an abandon that thrilled and invigorated her. She remained a long time in the water, half hoping that Mademoiselle Reisz would not wait for her. But Mademoiselle waited. She was very amiable during the walk back, and raved much over Edna's appearance in her bathing suit. She talked about music. She hoped that Edna would go to see her in the city, and wrote her address, with the stub of a pencil on a piece of card, which she found in her pocket. "When do you leave?" Asked Edna. "Next Monday. And you?" "The following week," answered Edna, adding, "It has been a pleasant summer, hasn't it, mademoiselle?" "Well, agreed, Mademoiselle Reisz," with a shrug, "rather pleasant, if it hadn't been for the mosquitoes and the Feeble twins." Chapter 17. The Pontelliers possessed a very charming home on Esplanade Street in New Orleans. It was a large, double cottage with a broad front veranda. Whose round fluted columns supported the sloping roof. The house was painted a dazzling white, the outside shutters, or jalousies. In the yard, which was kept scrupulously neat, were flowers and plants of every description which flourishes in South Louisiana. Within doors, the appointments were perfect after the conventional type. The softest carpets and rugs covered the floors. Rich and tasteful draperies hung at doors and windows. There were paintings, selected with judgment and discrimination, upon the walls. The cut glass, the silver, the heavy damask which daily appeared upon the table, were the envy of many women whose husbands were less generous than Mr. Pontellier. Mr. Pontellier was very fond of walking about his house, examining its various appointments and details, to see that nothing was amiss. He greatly valued his possessions, chiefly because they were his, and derived a genuine pleasure from contemplating a painting, a statuette, a rare lace curtain, no matter what, after he had bought it and placed it among his household gods. On Tuesday afternoons, Tuesday being Mrs. Pontellier's reception day, there was a constant stream of callers' women who came in carriages, or in the streetcars, or walked when the air was soft and distance permitted. A light-colored mulatto boy, in dress coat and bearing a diminutive silver tray for the reception of cards, admitted them. A maid, in white fluted cap, offered the callers liqueur, coffee, or chocolate, as they might desire. Mrs. Pontellier, attired in a handsome reception gown, remained in the drawing-room the entire afternoon, receiving her visitors. Men sometimes called in the evening, with their wives. This had been the program which Mrs. Pontellier had religiously followed since her marriage, 6 years before. Certain evenings during the week she and her husband attended the opera, or sometimes the play. Mr. Pontellier left his home in the mornings, between 9 and 10 o'clock, and rarely returned before 6:30 or 7 in the evening, dinner being served at 7:30. He and his wife seated themselves at table one Tuesday evening, a few weeks after their return from Grand Isle. They were alone together. The boys were being put to bed. The patter of their bare, escaping feet could be heard occasionally, as well as the pursuing voice of the quadroon, lifted in mild protest and entreaty. Mrs. Pontellier did not wear her usual Tuesday reception gown. She was in ordinary house dress. Mr. Pontellier, who was observant about such things, noticed it, as he served the soup and handed it to the boy in waiting. Tired out, Edna? Whom did you have? Many callers? He asked. He tasted his soup and began to season it with pepper, salt, vinegar, mustard, everything within reach. There were a good many, replied Edna, who was eating her soup with evident satisfaction. I found their cards when I got home. I was out, exclaimed her husband, with something like genuine consternation in his voice, as he laid down the vinegar cruet and looked at her through his glasses. Why? What could have taken you out on Tuesday? What did you have to do? Nothing. I simply felt like going out, and I went out. Well, I hope you left some suitable excuse, said her husband, somewhat appeased, as he added a dash of cayenne pepper to the soup. No, I left no excuse. I told Joe to say I was out, that was all. Why, my dear, I should think you'd understand by this time that people don't do such things. We've got to observe lay convenances if we ever expect to get on and keep up with the procession. If you felt that you had to leave home this afternoon, you should have left some suitable explanation for your absence. This soup is really impossible. It's strange that woman hasn't learned yet to make a decent soup. Any free lunch stand in town serves a better one. Was Mrs. Belthrop here? Bring the tray with the cards, Joe. I don't remember who was here. The boy retired and returned after a moment, bringing the tiny silver tray, which was covered with ladies' visiting cards. He handed it to Mrs. Pontellier. Give it to Mr. Pontellier, she said. Joe offered the tray to Mr. Pontellier and removed the soup. Mr. Pontellier scanned the names of his wife's callers, reading some of them aloud, with comments as he read. The Mrs. Del Cedas. I worked a big deal in futures for their father this morning. Nice pearls. It's time they were getting married.
Mrs.
Belthrop. Tell you what it is, Edna. We can't afford to snap Mrs. Belthrop. Why? Belthrop could buy and sell us 10 times over. His business is worth a good round sum to me. You'd better write her a note. James Highcamp.
You?
The less you have to do, Mrs. Highcamp, the better. Madame Laforce came all the way from Carrollton to poor old soul. Miss Wiggs, Mrs. Eleanor Bolton's. He pushed the cards aside. Mercy, exclaimed Edna, who had been fuming. Why are you taking the thing so seriously and making such a fuss over it? I'm not making any fuss over it, but it's just such seeming trifles that we've got to take seriously. Such things count. The fish was scorched. Mr. Pontellier would not touch it. Edna said she did not mind a little scorched taste. The roast was in some way not to his fancy, and he did not like the manner in which the vegetables were served. It seems to me, he said, we spend money enough in this house to procure at least one meal a day which a man could eat and retain his self-respect. You used to think the cook was a treasure, returned Edna indifferently. Perhaps she was when she first came, but cooks are only human. They need looking after, like any other class of persons that you employ. Suppose I didn't look after the clerks in my office. Just let them run things their own way? They'd soon make a nice mess of me and my business. Where are you going? Asked Edna, seeing that her husband arose from table without having eaten a morsel, except a taste of the highly seasoned. I'm going to get my dinner at the club. Good night. He went into the hall, took his hat and stick from the stand, and left the house. She was somewhat familiar with such scenes. They had often made her very unhappy. On a few previous occasions, she had been completely deprived of any desire to finish her dinner. Sometimes she had gone into the kitchen to administer a tardy rebuke to the cook. Once she went to her room and studied the cookbook during an entire evening, finally writing out a menu for the week, which left her harassed with the feeling that, after all, she had accomplished no good that was worth the name. But that evening Edna finished her dinner alone, with forced deliberation. Her face was flushed, and her eyes flamed with some inward fire that lighted them. After finishing her dinner, she went to her room, having instructed the boy to tell any other callers that she was indisposed. It was a large, beautiful room, rich and picturesque, in the soft, dim light, which the maid had turned low. She went and stood at an open window, and looked out upon the deep tangle of the garden below. All the mystery and witchery of the night seemed to have gathered there amid the perfumes and the dusky and tortuous outlines of flowers and foliage. She was seeking herself and finding herself in just such sweet half-darkness which met her moods. But the voices were not soothing that came to her from the darkness and the sky above and the stars. They jeered and sounded mournful notes without promise, devoid even of hope. She turned back into the room and began to walk to and fro down its whole length without stopping, without resting. She carried in her hands a thin handkerchief, which she tore into ribbons, rolled into a ball, and flung from her. Once she stopped, and taking off her wedding ring, flung it upon the carpet. When she saw it lying there, she stamped her heel upon it, striving to crush it. But her small boot heel did not make an indenture, not a mark upon the little glittering circlet. In a swooping passion, she seized a glass vase from the table and flung it upon the tiles of the hearth. She wanted to destroy something. The crash and clatter were what she wanted to hear. A maid, alarmed at the din of breaking glass, entered the room to discover what was the matter. A vase fell upon the hearth, said Edna. Never mind. Leave it till morning. Oh, you might get some of the grass in your feet, ma'am, insisted the young woman, picking up bits of the broken vase that were scattered upon the carpet. And here's your ring, ma'am, under the chair. Edna held out her hand, and taking the ring, slipped it upon her finger. Chapter 18. The following morning, Mr. Pontellier, upon leaving for his office, asked Edna if she would not meet him in town in order to look at some new fixtures for the library. I hardly think we need new fixtures, Léonce. Don't let us get anything new. You're too extravagant. I don't believe you ever think of saving or putting by. The way to become rich is to make money, my dear Edna, not to save it, he said. He regretted that she did not feel inclined to go with him and select new fixtures. He kissed her good-bye and told her she was not looking well and must take care of herself. She was unusually pale and very quiet. She stood on the front veranda as he quitted the house and absently picked a few sprays of jessamine that grew upon a trellis nearby. She inhaled the odor of the blossoms and thrust them into the bosom of her white morning gown. The boys were dragging along the banquette a small express wagon, which they had filled with blocks and sticks. The quadroon was following them with little quick steps, having assumed a fictitious animation and alacrity for the occasion. A fruit vendor was crying his wares in the street, Edna looked straight before her with a self-absorbed expression upon her face. She felt no interest in anything about her. The street, the children, the fruit vendor, the flowers growing there under her eyes were all part and parcel of an alien world, which had suddenly become antagonistic. She went back into the house. She had thought of speaking to the cook concerning her blunders of the previous night, but Mr. Pontellier had saved her that disagreeable mission for which she was so poorly fitted. Mr. Pontellier's arguments were usually convincing with those whom he employed. He left home feeling quite sure that he and Edna would sit down that evening, and possibly a few subsequent evenings, to a dinner deserving of the name. Edna spent an hour or two in looking over some of her old sketches. She could see their shortcomings and defects, which were glaring in her eyes. She tried to work a little, but found she was not in the humor. Finally, she gathered together a few of the sketches, those which she considered the least discreditable, and she carried them with her when, a little later, she dressed and left the house. She looked handsome and distinguished in her street gown. The tan of the seashore had left her face, and her forehead was smooth, white, and polished beneath her heavy, yellow-brown hair. There were a few freckles on her face, and a small, dark mole near the under lip and one on the temple, half hidden in her hair. As Edna walked along the street, she was thinking of Robert. She was still under the spell of her infatuation. She had tried to forget him, realizing the inutility of remembering, but the thought of him was like an obsession, ever pressing itself upon her. But once that wasn't so much about their events, as if she were cleared on urgent readings that had been tired from this time to leave, without being mostly noted about his brothers behind. Edna was on her way to Madame Ratignolle's. Their intimacy, begun at Grand Isle, had not declined, and they had seen each other with some frequency since their return to the city. The Ratignolles lived at no great distance from Edna's home, on the corner of a side street where Monsieur Ratignolles owned and conducted a drugstore which enjoyed a steady and prosperous trade. His father had been in the business before him, and Monsieur Ratignolle stood well in the case and bore an enviable reputation for integrity and clear-headedness. His family lived in commodious apartments over the store, having an entrance on the side, within the porte cochere. There was something which Edna thought very French, very foreign, about their whole manner of living. In the large and pleasant salon, which extended across the width of the house, the Ratignolles entertained their friends once a fortnight with a soirée musicale, sometimes diversified by card-playing. There was a friend who played upon the cello. One brought his flute, and another his violin, while there were some who sang, and a number who performed upon the piano, with various degrees of taste. The Ratignolles' soirées musicales were widely known, and it was considered a privilege to be invited to them. Edna found her friend engaged in assorting the clothes which had returned that morning from the laundry. She at once abandoned her occupation upon seeing Edna, who had been ushered without ceremony into her presence. "Sita can do it as well as I. It is really her business," she explained to Edna, who apologized for interrupting her, and she summoned a young black woman, whom she instructed, in French, to be very careful in checking off the list which she handed her. She told her to notice particularly if a fine linen handkerchief of Monsieur Ravignolle's, which was missing last week, had been returned, and to be sure to set to one side such pieces as required mending and darning. Then, placing an arm around Edna's waist, she led her to the front of the house, to the salon, where it was cool and sweet, with the odor of great roses that stood upon the hearth in jars. Madame Ratignolle looked more beautiful than ever there at home, in a negligee which left her arms almost wholly bare and exposed the rich, melting curves of her white throat. "Perhaps I shall be able to paint your picture some day," said Edna with a smile when they were seated. She produced the roll of sketches and started to unfold them. I believe I ought to work again. I feel as if I wanted to be doing something. What do you think of them? Do you think it worthwhile to take it up again and study some more? I might study for a while with Leopold. She knew that Madame Ratignolle's opinion in such a matter would be next to valueless, that she herself had not alone decided but determined. But she sought the words of praise and encouragement. Your talent is immense, dear. Nonsense, protested Edna. Well, pleased. Immense, I tell you, persisted Madame Ratignolle, surveying the sketches one by one, at close range, then holding them at arm's length, narrowing her eyes and dropping her head on one side. Surely this Bavarian peasant is worthy of framing, and this basket of apples. And never have I seen anything more lifelike. One might almost be tempted to reach out a hand and take one. Edna could not control a feeling which bordered upon complacency at her friend's praise, even realizing, as she did, its true worth. She retained a few of the sketches and gave all the rest to Madame Ratignolle, who appreciated the gift far beyond its value, and proudly exhibited the pictures to her husband when he came up from the store a little later for his midday dinner. Mr. Ratignolle was one of those men who are called the salt of the earth. His cheerfulness was unbounded, and it was matched by his goodness of heart, his broad charity, and common sense. He and his wife spoke English with an accent, which was only discernible through its un-English emphasis, and a certain carefulness and deliberation. Edna's husband spoke English with no accent whatever. The Ratignolles understood each other perfectly. If ever the fusion of two human beings into one has been accomplished on this sphere, it was surely in their union. As Edna seated herself at table with them, she thought, better a dinner of herbs, though it did not take her long to discover that it was no dinner of herbs, but a delicious repast, simple, choice, and in every way satisfying. Monsieur Ratignolle was delighted to see her, though he found her looking not so well as at Grand Isle, and he advised a tonic. He talked a good deal on various topics, a little politics, some city news, and neighborhood gossip. He spoke with an animation and earnestness that gave an exaggerated importance to every syllable he uttered. His wife was keenly interested in everything he said, laying down her fork the better to listen, chiming in, taking the words out of his mouth. Edna felt depressed rather than soothed after leaving them. The little glimpse of domestic harmony which had been offered her gave her no regret, no longing. It was not a condition of life which fitted her, and she could see in it, but an appalling and hopeless ennui. She was moved by a kind of commiseration for Madame Ratignolle, a pity for that colorless existence which never uplifted its possessor beyond the region of blind contentment, in which no moment of anguish ever visited her soul, in which she would never have the taste of life's delirium. Edna vaguely wondered what she meant by life's delirium. If it crossed her thought, like some unsought, extraneous impression. Chapter 19. Edna could not help but think that it was very foolish, very childish, to have stamped upon her wedding ring and smashed the crystal vase upon the tiles. She was visited by no more outbursts, moving her to such futile expedients. She began to do as she liked and to feel as she liked. She completely abandoned her Tuesdays at home and did not return the visits of those who had called upon her. She made no ineffectual efforts to conduct her household en bonne ménagère, going and coming as it suited her fancy, and so far as she was able, lending herself to any passing caprice. Mr. Pontellier had been a rather courteous husband, so long as he met a certain tacit submissiveness in his wife. But her new and unexpected line of conduct completely bewildered him. It shocked him. Then her absolute disregard for her duties as a wife angered him. When Mr. Pontellier became rude, Edna grew insolent. She had resolved never to take another step backward. It seems to me the utmost folly for a woman at the head of a household and the mother of children to spend in an atelier days which would be better employed contriving for the comfort of her family. I feel like painting, answered Edna. Perhaps I shan't always feel like it. Then, in God's name, paint. But don't let the family go to the devil. There's Madame Latino, because she keeps up her music, she doesn't let everything else go to chaos. And she's more of a musician than you are a painter. She's a musician, and I'm not a painter. It isn't on account of painting that I let things go. On account of what, then? Oh, I don't know. Let me alone. You bother me. It sometimes entered Mr. Pontellier's mind to wonder if his wife were not growing a little unbalanced mentally. He could see, plainly, that she was not herself. That is, he could not see that she was becoming herself and daily casting aside that fictitious self, which we assume like a garment with which to appear before the world. Her husband let her alone, as she requested, and went away to his office. Edna went up to her atelier, a bright room in the top of the house. She was working with great energy and interest, without accomplishing anything, however, which satisfied her, even in the smallest degree. For a time, she had the whole household enrolled in the service of art. The boys prosed for her. They thought it amusing at first, but the occupation soon lost its attractiveness when they discovered that it was not a game arranged especially for their entertainment. The quadroon sat for hours before Edna's palette, patient as a savage, while the housemaid took charge of the children, and the drawing-room went undusted. But the housemaid, too, served her term as model when Edna perceived that the young woman's back and shoulders were molded on classic lines, and that her hair, loosened from its confining cap, became an inspiration. While Edna worked, I'm saying low.
Huh?
Si tu savais. It moved her with recollections. She could hear again the ripple of the water, the flapping sail. She could see the glint of the moon upon the bay, and could feel the soft, gusty beating of the hot south wind. A subtle current of desire passed through her body, weakening her hold upon the brushes and making her eyes burn. There were days when she was very happy, without knowing why. She was happy to be alive and breathing, when her whole being seemed to be one with the sunlight, the color, the odors, the luxuriant warmth of some perfect southern day. She liked then to wander alone into strange and unfamiliar places. She discovered many a sunny, sleepy corner, fashioned to dream in. And she found it good to dream, and to be alone, and unmolested. There were days when she was unhappy. She did not know why, when it did not seem worthwhile to be glad or sorry, to be alive or dead. Life appeared to her like a grotesque pandemonium, and humanity like worms. She could not work on such a day, nor weave fancies to stir her pulses and warm her blood. Chapter 20. It was during such a mood that Edna hunted up Mademoiselle Reisz. She had not forgotten the rather disagreeable impression left upon her by their last interview, but she nevertheless felt a desire to see her, above all, to listen while she played upon the piano. Quite early in the afternoon, she started upon her quest for the pianist. Unfortunately, she had mislaid or lost Mademoiselle Reiz's card, and looking up her address in the city directory, she found that the woman lived on Bienville Street, some distance away. The directory which fell into her hands was a year or more old, however, and upon reaching the number indicated, Edna discovered that the house was occupied by a respectable family of mulattoes who had chambres garnies to let. They had been living there for 6 months and knew absolutely nothing of a Mademoiselle Reisz. In fact, they knew nothing of any of their names. Their lodgers were all people of the highest distinction. They assured Edna She did not linger to discuss class distinctions with Madame Poupon, but hastened to a neighboring grocery store, feeling sure that Mademoiselle would have left her address with the proprietor. He knew Mademoiselle Rice a good deal better than he wanted to know her. He informed his questioner. In truth, he did not want to know her at all, or anything concerning her. The most disagreeable and unpopular woman who ever lived in Bienval Street. He thanked heaven she had left the neighborhood, and was equally thankful that he did not know where she had gone. Edna's desire to see Mademoiselle Reisz had increased tenfold since these unlooked-for obstacles had arisen to thwart it. She was wondering who could give her the information she sought, when it suddenly occurred to her that Madame Libera would be the one most likely to do so. She knew it was useless to ask with Madame Maintenon, who was on the most distant terms with the musician, and preferred to know nothing concerning her. She had once been almost as emphatic in expressing herself upon the subject as the corner grocer. Edna knew that Madame Lebrun had returned to the city, for it was the middle of November. And she also knew where the Lebons lived, on Chartres Street. Their home from the outside looked like a prison, with iron bars before the door and lower windows. The iron bars were a relic of the old regime, and no one had ever thought of dislodging them. At the side was a high fence enclosing the garden. A gate or door opening upon the street was locked. Edna rang the bell at this side garden gate and stood upon the banquette, waiting to be admitted. It was Victor who opened the gate for her. A black woman, wiping her hands upon her apron, was close at his heels. Before she saw them, Edna could hear them in altercation. The woman, plainly an anomaly, claiming the right to be allowed to perform her duties, one of which was to answer the bell. Victor was surprised and delighted to see Miss Pontellier, and he made no attempt to conceal either his astonishment or his delight. He was a dark-browed, good-looking youngster of 19, greatly resembling his mother, but with 10 times her impetuosity. He instructed the black woman to go at once, and informed Madame Lebrun that Mrs. Pontellier desired to see her. The woman grumbled a refusal to do part of her duty when she had not been permitted to do it all, and started back to her interrupted task of weeding the garden. Whereupon Victor administered a rebuke in the form of a volley of abuse, which, owing to its rapidity and incoherence, was all but incomprehensible to Edna. Whatever it was, the rebuke was convincing, for the woman dropped her hoe and went mumbling into the house. Edna did not wish to enter. It was very pleasant there, on the side porch, where there were chairs, a wicker lounge, and a small table. She seated herself, for she was tired from her long tramp, and she began to rock gently and smooth out the folds of her silk parasol. Victor drew up his chair beside her. He at once explained that the black woman's offensive conduct was all due to imperfect training, as he was not there to take her in hand. He had only come up from the island the morning before, and expected to return next day. He stayed all winter at the island. He lived there, and kept the place in order, and got things ready for the summer visitors. But a man needed occasional relaxation. He informed Mrs. Pontellier, and every now and again he drummed up a pretext to bring him to the city. My! But he had had a time of it the evening before. He wouldn't want his mother to know, and he began to talk in a whisper. He was scintillant with recollections. Of course, he couldn't think of telling Mrs. Pontellier all about it, she being a woman and not comprehending such things. But it all began with a girl peeping and smiling at him through the shutters as he passed by. Oh? But she was a beauty. Certainly, he smiled back and went up and talked to her. Mrs. Pontellier did not know him if she supposed he was one to let an opportunity like that escape him. Despite herself, the youngster amused her. She must have betrayed in her look some degree of interest. But the boy grew more daring, and Mrs. Pontellier might have found herself, in a little while, listening to a highly colored story, but for the timely appearance of Madame Lebrun. That lady was still clad in white, according to her custom of the summer. Her eyes beamed an effusive welcome. Would not Mrs. Pontellier go inside? Would she partake of some refreshment? Why had she not been there before? How was that, dear Mr. Pontellier? And how were those sweet children? Had Mrs. Pontellier ever known such a warm November? Victor went and reclined on the wicker lounge behind his mother's chair, where he commanded a view of Edna's face. He had taken her parasol from her hands while he spoke to her, and he now lifted it and twirled it above him as he lay on his back. And Madame Lebrun complained that it was so dull coming back to the city, that she saw so few people now, that even Victor, when he came up from the island for a day or two, had so much to occupy him and engage his time. She somehow felt like a confederate in crime, and tried to look severe and disapproving. There had been but 2 letters from Robert, with little in them, they told her. Victor said it was really not worthwhile to go inside for the letters, when his mother entreated him to go in search of them. He remembered the contents, which in truth he rattled off very glibly when put to the test. One letter was written from Vera Cruz, and the other from the city of Mexico. He had met Montel, who was doing everything toward his advancement. So far, the financial situation was no improvement over the one he had left in New Orleans. But of course, the prospects were vastly better. He wrote of the city of Mexico, the buildings, the people, and their habits, the conditions of life which he found there. He sent his love to the family. He enclosed a check to his mother, and hoped she would affectionately remember him to all his friends. That was about the substance of the 2 letters. Edna felt that if there had been a message for her, she would have received it. The despondent frame of mind in which she had left home began again to overtake her, and she remembered that she wished to find Mademoiselle Reisz. Madame Lebrun knew where Mademoiselle Reisz lived. She gave Edna the address, regretting that she would not consent to stay and spend the remainder of the afternoon, and pay a visit to Mademoiselle Reisz some other day. The afternoon was already well advanced. Victor escorted her out upon the banquette, lifted her parasol, and held it over her while he walked to the car with him. He entreated her to bear in mind that the disclosures of the afternoon were strictly confidential. She laughed and bantered him a little, remembering too late that she should have been dignified and reserved. How handsome Mrs. Pontellier looked, said Madame Lebrun to her son. Ravishing, he admitted. The city atmosphere has improved her. Some way she doesn't seem like the same woman. Chapter 21. Some people contended that the reason Mademoiselle Reisz always chose apartments up under the roof was to discourage the approach of beggars, peddlers, and cullers. There were plenty of windows in her little front room. They were for the most part dingy, but as they were nearly always open, it did not make so much difference. They often admitted into the room a good deal of smoke and soot, but at the same time, all the light and air that there was came through them. From her windows could be seen the crescent of the river, the masts of ships, and the big chimneys of the Mississippi steamers. A magnificent piano crowded the apartment. In the next room she slept, and in the third and last she harbored a gasoline stove on which she cooked her meals when disinclined to descend to the neighboring restaurant. It was there also that she ate, keeping her belongings in the rare old buffet, dingy and battered from 100 years. When Edna knocked at Mademoiselle Reisz's front room door and entered, she discovered that person standing beside the window, engaged in mending or patching an old Prunauer gaiter. The little musician laughed all over when she saw Edna. Her laugh consisted of a contortion of the face and all the muscles of the body. She seemed strikingly homely, standing there in the afternoon light. She still wore the shabby lace and the artificial bunch of violets on the side of her head. "And so you remembered me at last," said Mademoiselle. "I said to myself, but she will never come." "Did you want me to come?" asked Edna, with a smile. "I had not thought much about it," answered Mademoiselle. The two had seated themselves on a little bumpy sofa, which stood against the wall. "I am glad, however, that you came. I have the water boiling back there and was just about to make some coffee. You will drink a cup with me. And how is la belle dame?" "Always handsome, but always healthy, always contented." She took Edna's hand between her strong, wiry fingers, holding it loosely without warmth, and executing a sort of double theme upon the back and palm. "Yes," she went on, "I sometimes thought she will never come. She promised, as those women in society always do, without me. She will not come."
For I really don't believe you like me, Mrs. Pontellier.
"I don't know whether I like you or not," replied Edna, gazing down at the little woman with a quizzical look. The candor of Mrs. Pontellier's admission greatly pleased Mamillielle Reese. She expressed her gratification by repairing forthwith to the region of the gasoline stove and rewarding her guest with the promised cup of coffee. The coffee and the biscuit accompanying it proved very acceptable to Edna, who has declined refreshment at Madame Lebrun's and was now beginning to feel hungry. Mademoiselle set the tray, which she brought in upon a small table near at hand, and seated herself once again on the lumpy sofa. "I have had a letter from your friend," she remarked, as she poured a little cream into Edna's cup and handed it. "My friend?" "Yes, your friend Robert. He wrote to me from the city of Mexico." "Wrote to you?" A mother, repeated Edna in amazement, stirring her coffee absently. "Yes, to me. Why not? Don't stir all the warmth out of your coffee. Drink it." "But the letter might as well have been sent to you. It was nothing but Mrs. Pontellier from beginning to end." "Let me see it," requested the young woman, entreatingly. "No, a letter concerns no one but the person who writes it, and the one to whom it is written." "Haven't you just said it concerned me from beginning to end?" "It was written about you, not to you. Have you seen Mrs. Pontellier?" "How is she looking?" he asks. "As Mrs. Pontellier says, or as Mrs. Pontellier once said, if Mrs. Pontellier should call upon you, play for her that impromptu of Chopin's, my favorite. I heard it here a day or two ago, but not as you play it. I should like to know how it affects her, and so on, as if you supposed we were constantly in each other's society. Let me see the letter."
Oh, no.
"Have you answered it?" "No." "Let me see the letter." "No." And again, "No." "Then play the impromptu for me." "It is growing late. What time do you have to be home?" "Time doesn't concern me." "Your question seems a little rude." "Play the impromptu." "But you have told me nothing of yourself. What are you doing?" "Painting," laughed Edna. "I am becoming an artist. Think of it." "Oh, an artist. You have pretensions, madam." "Why pretensions?" "You think I could not become an artist. I do not know you well enough to say. I do not know your talent or your temperament. To be an artist includes much. One must possess many gifts, absolute gifts, which have not been acquired by one's own effort. And moreover, to succeed, the artist must possess the courageous soul." "What do you mean by the courageous soul?" "Courageous, underscore, ma foi, the brave soul. The soul that dares and defies." "Show me the letter and play for me impromptu." You see that I have persistence. Does that quality count for anything in art? It counts with a foolish old woman whom you have captivated, replied Mademoiselle, with her wriggling laugh. The letter was right there, at hand, in the drawer of the little table, upon which Edna had just placed her coffee cup. Meadowlark's one opened the drawer and drew forth the letter, the topmost one. She placed it in Edna's hands, and without further comment arose and went to the piano. Mademoiselle played a soft interlude. It was an improvisation. She sat low at the instrument, and the lines of her body settled into ungraceful curves and angles that David and gradually and imperceptibly the interlude melted into the soft open minor chords of the Chopin impromptu. Edna did not know when the impromptu began or ended. She sat in the sofa corner, reading Robert's letter by the fading light. Mademoiselle had glided from the Chopin into the quivering love notes of Isolde's song, and back again to the impromptu with its soulful and poignant longing. The shadows deepened in the little room. The music grew strange and fantastic, turbulent, insistent, plaintive and soft with entreaty. The shadows grew deeper. The music filled the room. It floated out upon the night, over the housetops, the crescent of the river, losing itself in the silence of the upper air. Edna was sobbing, just as she had wept one midnight at Grand Isle when strange new voices awoke in her. She arose in some agitation to take her departure. May I come again, mademoiselle? She asked at the threshold. Come whenever you feel like it. Be careful. The stairs and landings are dark. Don't stumble. Mademoiselle re-entered and lit a candle. Robert's letter was on the floor. She stooped and picked it up. It was crumpled and damp with tears. Mademoiselle smoothed the letter out, restored it to the envelope, and replaced it in the table drawer. Chapter 22. One morning on his way into town, Mr. Pontellier stopped at the house of his old friend and family physician, Dr. Mandelet. The doctor was a semi-retired physician, resting, as the saying is, upon his laurels. He bore a reputation for wisdom rather than skill, leaving the active practice of medicine to his assistants and younger contemporaries, and was much sought for in matters of consultation. A few families, united to him by bonds of friendship, he still attended when they required the services of a physician. The Pontelliers were among these. Mr. Pontellier found the doctor reading at the open window of his study. His house stood rather far back from the street, in the center of a delightful garden, so that it was quiet and peaceful at the old gentleman's study window. He was a great reader. He stared out disapprovingly over his eyeglasses as Mr. Pontellier entered, wondering who had the temerity to disturb him at that hour of the morning.
Ah, Pontellier.
Not sick, I hope. Come and have a seat. What news do you bring this morning? He was quite portly, with a profusion of gray hair and small blue eyes, which age had robbed of much of their brightness, but none of their penetration. Oh, I'm never sick, doctor. You know that I come of tough fiber, of that old Creole race of Pompeiers that dry up and finally blow away. I came to consult. No, not precisely to consult. To talk to you about Edna. I don't know what ails her. Madame Pontellier not well, marveled the doctor. Why, I saw her, I think it was a week ago, walking along Canal Street, the picture of health, it seemed to me. Yes, she seems quite well, said Mr. Pontellier, leaning forward and whirling his stick between his two hands. But she doesn't act well. She's odd. She's not like herself. I can't make her out, and I thought perhaps you'd help me. But how does she act? Inquired the doctor, Well, it isn't easy to explain, said Mr. Pontellier, throwing himself back in his chair. She lets the housekeeping go to the dickens. Well, women are not all alike, my dear Pontellier. We've got to consider, I know that. I told you I couldn't explain. Her whole attitude toward me and everybody and everything has changed. And you know I have a quick temper, but I don't want to quarrel or be rude to a woman, especially my wife, yet I'm driven to it, and feel like 10,000 devils after I've made a fool of myself. She's making it devilishly uncomfortable for me. He went on nervously. She's got some sort of notion in her head concerning the eternal rights of women. And you understand. We meet in the morning at the breakfast table. The old gentleman lifted his shaggy eyebrows, protruded his thick nether lip, and tapped the arms of his chair with his cushioned fingertips. What have you been doing to her, Pontellier? Dilling, Bleu. Has she asked the doctor with a smile? Has she been associating of late with a circle of pseudo-intellectual women, super-spiritual superior beings? My wife has been telling me about them. That's the trouble, broke in Mr. Pontellier. She hasn't been associating with anyone. She has abandoned her Tuesdays at home, has thrown over all her acquaintances, and goes tramping about by herself, moping in the streetcars, getting in after dark. I tell you, she's peculiar. I don't like it. I feel a little worried over it. This was a new aspect for the doctor. Nothing hereditary. He asked seriously. Nothing peculiar about her family antecedents, is there? Oh, no. Indeed, she comes of sound old Presbyterian Kentucky stock. The old gentleman, her father, I have heard, used to atone for his weekday sins with his Sunday devotions. I know for a fact that his racehorses literally ran away with the prettiest bit of Kentucky farming land I ever laid eyes upon. Margaret, you know Margaret? She has all the Presbyterianism undiluted. And the youngest is something of a vixen. By the way, she gets married in a couple weeks from now. Send your wife up to the wedding, exclaimed the doctor, foreseeing a happy solution. Let her stay among her own people for a while. It will do her good. That's what I want her to do. She won't go to the marriage. She says a wedding is one of the most lamentable spectacles on earth. Nice thing for a woman to say to her husband, exclaimed Mr. Pontellier, fuming anew at the recollection. Pontellier, said the doctor, after a moment's reflection, let your wife alone for a while. Don't bother her, and don't let her bother you. Woman, my dear friend, is a very peculiar and delicate organism. A sensitive and highly organized woman, such as I know Mrs. Pontellier to be, is especially peculiar. It would require an inspired psychologist to deal successfully with them. And when ordinary fellows like you and me attempt to cope with their idiosyncrasies, the result is bungling. Most women are moody and whimsical. This is some passing whim of your wife due to some cause or causes which you and I needn't try to fathom. But it will pass happily over, especially if you let her alone. Send her around to see. Oh, I couldn't do that. There'd be no reason for it, objected Mr. Pontellier. Then I'll go around and see her, said the doctor. We'll drop in to dinner some evening en bon ami. Do, by all means, urged Mr. Pontellier. What evening will you come? Say Thursday. Will you come Thursday? He asked, rising to take his leave. Very well. Thursday. My wife may possibly have some engagement for me Thursday. In case she has, I shall let you know. Otherwise, you may expect me. Mr. Pontellier turned before leaving to say, I am going to New York on business very soon. I have a big scheme on hand and want to be on the field proper to pull the ropes and handle the ribbons. We'll let you in on the inside if you say so. Doctor. He laughed. No, I thank you, my dear sir, returned the doctor. I leave such ventures to you younger men, with the fever of life still in your blood. What I wanted to say, continued Mr. Pontellier, with his hand on the knob, I may have to be absent a good while. Would you advise me to take Edna along? By all means, if she wishes to go. If not, leave her here. Don't contradict her. The mood will pass, I assure you. It may take a month to 3 months, possibly longer, but it will pass. Have patience. Well, goodbye, aujourd'hui, said Mr. Pontellier, as he let himself out. The doctor would have liked, during the course of conversation, to ask, Is there any man in the case? But he knew his Creole too well to make such a blunder as that. He did not resume his book immediately, but sat for a while meditatively looking out into the garden. Chapter 23. Edna's father was in the city, and had been with them several days. She was not very warmly or deeply attached to him, but they had certain tastes in common, and when together they were companionable. His coming was in the nature of a welcome disturbance. It seemed to furnish a new direction for her emotions. He had come to purchase a wedding gift for his daughter, Janet, and an outfit for himself in which he might make a creditable appearance at her marriage. Mr. Pontellier had selected the bridal gift, as everyone immediately connected with him always deferred in his taste in relationship in such matters, and his suggestions, and on the question of dress, which too often assumes the nature of a problem, were of inestimable value to his father-in-law. But for the past few days, the old gentleman had been upon Edna's hands, and in his society she was becoming acquainted with a new set of sensations. He had been a colonel in the Confederate Army, and still maintained, with the title, the military bearing, which had always accompanied it. His hair and mustache were white and silky, emphasizing the rugged bronze of his phiz. He was tall and thin, and wore his coats padded, which gave a fictitious kind of breadth and depth to his shoulders and chest. Edna and her father looked very distinguished together, and excited a good deal of notice during their perambulations. Upon his arrival, she began by introducing him to her atelier, and making a sketch of him. He took the whole matter very seriously. If her talent had been tenfold greater than it was, it would not have surprised him, convinced as he was that he had bequeathed to all of his daughters the germs of a masterful capability, which only depended upon their own efforts to be directed towards successful achievement. Before her pencil, he sat rigid and unflinching, as he had faced the cannon's mouth in days gone by. He resented the intrusion of the children, who gaped with wondering eyes at him, sitting so stiff up there in their mother's bright atelier. When they drew near, he motioned them away with an expressive action of the foot, loath to disturb the fixed lines of his countenance, his arms, or his rigid shoulders. Edna, anxious to entertain him, invited Mademoiselle Reisz to meet him, having promised him a treat in her piano playing, but Mademoiselle declined the invitation. So together they attended a soirée musicale at the Ragnolis. Monsieur and Madame Ratignolle made much of the colonel, installing him as the guest of honor and engaging him at once to dine with them the following Sunday, or any day which he might select. Madame coquetted with him in the most captivating and naive manner, with eyes, gestures, and a profusion of compliments, till the colonel's old head felt 30 years younger on his padded shoulders. Edna marveled, not comprehending. She herself was almost devoid of coquetry. There were 1 or 2 men whom she observed at the soirée musicale, but she would never have felt moved to any kittenish display to attract their notice, to any feline or feminine wiles to express herself toward them. Their personality attracted her in an agreeable way. Her fancy selected them, and she was glad when a lull in the music gave them an opportunity to meet her and talk with her. Often on the street the glance of strange eyes had lingered in her memory, and sometimes had disturbed her. Mr. Pontellier did not attend these soirées musicales. He considered them bourgeois, and found more diversion at the club. To Madame Ratignolle, he said the music dispensed at her soirée was too heavy, too far beyond his untrained comprehension. His excuse flattered her, but she disapproved of Mr. Pontellier's club, and she was frank enough to tell Edna so. It's a pity Mr. Pontellier doesn't stay home more in the evenings. I think he would be more, well, you don't mind my saying it, more united if he did. Oh, dear no, said Edna, with a blank look in her eyes. What should I do if he stayed home? We wouldn't have anything to say to each other. She had not much of anything to say to her father for that matter, but he did not antagonize her. She discovered that he interested her, though she realized that he might not interest her long. And for the first time in her life, she felt as if she were thoroughly acquainted with him. He kept her busy serving him and ministering to his wants. It amused her to do so. She would not permit a servant or one of the children to do anything for him which she might do herself. Her husband noticed and thought it was the expression of a deep filial attachment which he had never suspected before. The colonel drank numerous toddies during the course of the day, which left him, however, imperturbed, and he was an expert at concocting strong drinks. He had even invented some, to which he had given fantastic names, and for whose manufacture he required diverse ingredients that it devolved upon Edna to procure for him. When Dr. Mandelet dined with the Pontelliers on Thursday, he could discern in Mrs. Pontellier no trace of that morbid condition which her husband had reported to him. She was excited, and in a manner radiant. She and her father had been to the race-course, and their thoughts, when they seated themselves at table, were still occupied with the events of the afternoon, and their talk was still of the track. The doctor had not kept pace with turf affairs. He had certain recollections of racing, in what he called the good old times, when the Lecompte stables flourished, and he drew upon this fund of memories so that he might not be left out and seem wholly devoid of the modern spirit. But he failed to impose upon the colonel, and was even far from impressing him with this trumped-up knowledge of bygone days. Edna had staked her father on his last venture, with the most gratifying results to both of them. Besides, they had met some very charming people, according to the colonel's impressions. Mrs. Mortimer Merriman and Mrs. James Highcamp, who were there with Alcée Arobin, had joined them and had enlivened the hours in a fashion that warmed him to think of. Mr. Pontellier himself had no particular leaning toward horse racing, and was even rather inclined to discourage it as a pastime, especially when he considered the fate of that blue-grass farm in Kentucky. He endeavored, in a general way, to express a particular disapproval, and only succeeded in arousing the ire and opposition of his father-in-law. A pretty dispute followed, in which Edna warmly espoused her father's cause, and the doctor remained neutral. He observed his hostess attentively from under his shaggy brows, and noted a subtle change which had transformed her from the listless woman he had known into a being who, for the moment, seemed palpitant with the forces of life. Her speech was warm and energetic. There was no repression in her glance or gesture. She reminded him of some beautiful sleep animal waking up in the sun. The dinner was excellent. The claret was warm, and the champagne was cold, and under their beneficent influence, the threatened unpleasantness melted and vanished with the fumes of the wine. Mr. Pontellier warmed up and grew reminiscent. He told some amusing plantation experiences, recollections of old Iberville in his youth, when he hunted the possum in company with some friendly darky, thrashed the pecan trees, shot the grosbeck, and roamed the woods and fields in mischievous idleness. The colonel, with little sense of humor and of the fitness of things, related a somber episode of those dark and bitter days, in which he had acted a conspicuous part and always formed a central figure. Nor was the doctor happier in his selection when he told the old ever-new and curious story of the waning of a woman's love, seeking strange new channels, only to return to its legitimate source after days of fear. It was one of the many little human documents which had been unfolded to him during his long career as a physician. The story did not seem especially to impress Edna. She had one of her own to tell, of a woman who paddled away with her lover one night in a pirogue and never came back. They were lost amid the Baratarian Islands, and no one ever heard of them or found trace of them from that day to this. It was a pure invention. She said that Madame Antoine had related it to her. That, also, was an invention. Perhaps it was a dream she had had, but every glowing word seemed real to those who listened. They could feel the hot breath of the southern night. They could hear the long sweep of the pirogue through the glistening moonlit water, the beating of birds' wings, rising startled from among the reeds in the salt water pools. The champagne was cold, and its subtle fumes played fantastic tricks with Edna's memory that night. Outside, away from the glow of the fire and the soft lamplight, the night was chill and murky. The doctor doubled his old-fashioned cloak across his breast as he strode home through the darkness. He knew his fellow creatures better than most men, knew that inner life which so seldom unfolds itself to unanointed eyes. He was sorry he had accepted Ponteilla's invitation. He was growing old and beginning to need rest and an imperturbed spirit. He did not want the secrets of other lives thrust upon him. I hope it isn't a Robin, he muttered to himself as he walked. I hope to heaven it isn't Alcée or Robin. Chapter 24. Edna and her father had a warm and almost violent dispute upon the subject of her refusal to attend her sister's wedding. Mr. Pontellier declined to interfere, to interpose either his influence or his authority. He was following Dr. Mandelet's advice and letting her do as she liked. The colonel reproached his daughter for her lack of filial kindness and respect, her want of sisterly affection and womanly consideration. His arguments were labored and unconvincing. He doubted if Janet would accept any excuse, forgetting that Edna had offered none. He doubted if Janet would ever speak to her again, and he was sure Margaret would not. Edna was glad to be rid of her father when he finally took himself off with his wedding garments and his bridal gifts, with his padded shoulders, his Bible reading, his toddies, and ponderous oaths. Mr. Pontellier followed him closely. He meant to stop at the wedding, on his way to New York, and endeavor by every means which money and love could devise to atone somewhat for Edna's incomprehensible action. You're too lenient by far, Leonce, asserted the colonel. Authority, coercion, are what is needed. Put your foot down good and hard, the only way to manage a wife. Take my word for it. The colonel was perhaps unaware that he had coerced his own wife into her grave. Mr. Pontellier had a vague suspicion of it, which he thought it needless to mention at that late day. Edna was not so consciously gratified at her husband's leaving home as she had been over the departure of her father. As the day approached when he was to leave her for a comparatively long stay, she grew melting and affectionate, remembering his many acts of consideration and his repeated expressions of an ardent attachment. She was solicitous about his health and his welfare. She bustled around, looking after his clothing, thinking about heavy underwear, quite as Madame Ratignolle would have done under similar circumstances. She cried when he went away, calling him her dear, good friend, and she was quite certain she would grow lonely before very long and go to join him. But after all, a radiant peace settled upon her when she at last found herself alone. Even the children were gone. Old Madame Pontellier had come herself and carried them off to Iberville with their quadroon. The old madame did not venture to say she was afraid they would be neglected during Léonce's absence. She hardly ventured to think so. She was hungry for them, even a little fierce in her attachment. She did not want them to be wholly children of the pavement. She always said, when begging to have them for a space, she wished them to know the country, with its streams, its fields, its woods, its freedom, so delicious to the young. She wished them to taste something of the life their father had lived and known and loved when he too was a little child. When Edna was at last alone, she breathed a big, genuine sigh of relief. A feeling that was unfamiliar, but very delicious, came over her. She walked all through the house, from one room to another, as if inspecting it for the first time. She tried the various chairs and lounges, as if she had never sat and reclined upon them before. And she perambulated around the outside of the house, investigating, looking to see if windows and shutters were secure and in order. The flowers were like new acquaintances. She approached them in a familiar spirit and made herself at home among them. The garden walks were damp, and Edna called to the maid to bring out her rubber sandals. And there she stayed, and stooped, digging around the plants, trimming, picking dead, dry leaves. The children's little Dawn came out, interfering, getting in her way. She scolded him, laughed at him, played with him. The garden smelled so good, and looked so pretty in the afternoon sunlight. Edna plucked all the bright flowers she could find, and went into the house with them, she and the little dog. Even the kitchen assumed a sudden interesting character which she had never before perceived. She went in to give directions to the cook, to say that the butcher would have to bring much less meat, that they would require only half their usual quantity of bread, of milk, and groceries. She told the cook that she herself would be greatly occupied during Mr. Pontellier's absence, and she begged her to take all thought and responsibility of the larder upon her own shoulders. That night, Edna dined alone. The candelabra, with a few candles in the center of the table, gave all the light she needed. Outside the circle of light in which she sat, the large dining room looked solemn and shadowy. The cook, placed upon her mettle, served a delicious repast, a luscious tenderloin boiled a point. The wine tasted good. The marron glacé seemed to be just what she wanted. It was so pleasant, too, to dine in a comfortable peignoir, that she thought a little sentimentally about Léonce and the children, and wondered what they were doing. As she gave a dainty scrap or two to the doggie, she talked intimately to him about Etienne and Raoul. He was beside himself with astonishment and delight over these companionable advances, and showed his appreciation by his little quick, snappy barks and a lively agitation. Then Edna sat in the library after dinner and read Emerson until she grew sleepy. She realized that she had neglected her reading and determined to start anew upon a course of improving studies now that her time was completely her own to do with as she liked. After a refreshing bath, Edna went to bed, and as she snuggled comfortably beneath the eiderdown, a sense of restfulness invaded her, such as she had not known before. Chapter 25. When the weather was dark and cloudy, Edna could not work. She needed the sun to mellow and temper her mood to the sticking point. She had reached a stage when she seemed to be no longer feeling her way, working when in the humor, with sureness and ease, and being devoid of ambition and striving not towards accomplishment. She drew satisfaction from the work in itself. On rainy or melancholy days, Edna went out and sought the society of the friends she had made at Grand Isle, or else she stayed indoors and nursed a mood with which she was becoming too familiar for her own comfort and peace of mind. It was not despair, but it seemed to her as if life were passing by, leaving its promise broken and unfulfilled. Yet there were other days when she listened, was led on, and deceived by fresh promises, which her youth held out to her. She went again to the races, and again. Alcée Arobin and Mrs. Highcamp called for her one bright afternoon in Arobin's drag. Mrs. Highcamp was a worldly but unaffected, intelligent, slim, tall blonde woman in the 40s, with an indifferent manner and blue eyes that stared. She had a daughter who served her as a pretext for cultivating the society of young men of fashion. Alcée Arobin was one of them. He was a familiar figure at the racecourse, the opera, the fashionable clubs. There was a perpetual smile in his eyes, which seldom failed to awaken a corresponding cheerfulness in any one who looked into them and listened to his good-humored voice. His manner was quiet, and at times a little insolent. He possessed a good figure, a pleasing face, not overburdened with depth of thought or feeling, and his dress was that of the conventional man of fashion. He admired Edna extravagantly, after meeting her at the races with her father. He had met her before, on other occasions, but she had seemed to him unapproachable until that day. It was at his instigation that Mrs. Highcamp called to ask her to go with them to the Jockey Club to witness the turf event of the season. There were possibly a few trackmen out there who knew the racehorse as well as Edna, but there was certainly none who knew it better. She sat between her two companions as one having authority to speak. She laughed at Arobin's pretensions and deplored Mrs. Highcamp's ignorance. The racehorse was a friend and intimate associate of her childhood. The atmosphere of the stables and the breath of the blue grass paddock revived in her memory and lingered in her nostrils. She did not perceive that she was talking like her father as the sleek geldings ambled in review before them. She played for very high stakes, and fortune favored her. The fever of the game flamed in her cheeks and eyes, and it got into her blood and into her brain like an intoxicant. People turned their heads to look at her, and more than one lent an attentive ear to her utterances, hoping thereby to secure the elusive but ever desired tip. Arobin caught the contagion of excitement, which drew him to Edna like a magnet. Mrs. Highcamp remained, as usual, unmoved, with her indifferent stare and uplifted eyebrows. Edna stayed and dined with Mrs. Highcamp upon being urged to do so. Arobin also remained and sent away his drag. The dinner was quiet and uninteresting, save for the cheerful efforts of Arobin to enliven things. Mrs. Highcamp deplored the absence of her daughter from the races and tried to convey to her what she had missed by going to the Dante reading instead of joining them. The girl held a geranium leaf up to her nose and said nothing, but looked knowing and noncommittal. Mr. Highcamp was a plain, bald-headed man who only talked under compulsion. He was unresponsive. Mrs. Highcamp was full of delicate courtesy and consideration toward her husband. She addressed most of her conversation to him at table. They sat in the library after dinner and read the evening papers together under the droplight, while the younger people went into the drawing-room nearby and talked. Miss Highcamp played some selections from Grieg upon the piano. She seemed to have apprehended all of the composer's coldness and none of his poetry. While Edna listened, she could not help wondering if she had lost her taste for music. And the time came for her to go home. Mr. Highcamp grunted a lame offer to escort her, looking down at his slippered feet with tactless concern. It was Arabin who took her home. The car ride was long, and it was late when they reached Esplanade Street. Robin asked permission to enter for a second to light his cigarette. His match safe was empty. He filled his match safe, but did not light his cigarette until he left her, after she had expressed her willingness to go to the races with him again. Edna was neither tired nor sleepy. She was hungry again, for the Highcamp dinner, though of excellent quality, had lacked abundance. She rummaged in the larder and brought forth a slice of Gruyere and some crackers. She opened a bottle of beer, which she found in the icebox. Edna felt extremely restless and excited. She vacantly hummed a fantastic tune as she poked at the wood embers on the hearth and munched a cracker. She wanted something to happen. Anything. She did not know what. She regretted that she had not made Robin stay a half hour to talk over the horses with her. She counted the money she had won, but there was nothing else to do, so she went to bed and tossed there for hours in a sort of monotonous agitation. In the middle of the night she remembered that she had forgotten to write her regular letter to her husband, and she decided to do so next day and tell him about her afternoon at the Jockey Club. She lay wide awake, composing a letter, which was nothing like the one which she wrote next day. When the maid awoke her in the morning, Edna was dreaming of Mr. Highcamp playing the piano at the entrance of a music store on Canal Street, while his wife was saying to Alcée Robin as they boarded an Esplanade Street car, "What a pity, but I must go." When, a few days later, Alcée Arvin again called for Edna in his drag, Mrs. Highcamp was not with him. He said they would pick her up, that as that lady had not been apprised of his intention of picking her up, she was not at home. The daughter was just leaving the house to attend the meeting of a branch, folklore society, and regretted that she could not accompany them. Arabin appeared nonplussed and asked Edna if there is anyone else that she cared to ask. Thankful, she did not deem it worth while to go in search of any of the fashionable acquaintances from whom she had withdrawn herself. She thought of Madame Ratignolle, but knew that her fair friend did not leave the house except to take a languid walk around the block with her husband after nightfall. Mademoiselle Rice would have laughed at such a request from Edna. Madame Lebrun might have enjoyed the outing, but for some reason Edna did not want her. So they went alone, she and Arabin. The afternoon was intensely interesting to her. The excitement came back upon her like a remittent fever. Her talk grew familiar and confidential. It was no labor to become intimate with Arabin. His manner invited easy confidence. The preliminary stage of becoming acquainted was one which he always endeavored to ignore when a pretty and engaging woman was concerned. He stayed and dined with Edna. He stayed and sat beside the wood fire. They laughed and talked, and before it was time to go, he was telling her how different life might have been if he had known her years before. With ingenuous frankness he spoke of what a wicked, ill-disciplined boy he had been, and impulsively drew up his cuff to exhibit upon his wrist the scar from a sabre cut which he had received in a duel outside of Paris when he was 19. She touched his hand as she scanned the red cicatrice on the inside of his white wrist. A quick impulse that was somewhat spasmodic impelled her fingers to close in a sort of clutch upon his hand. He felt the pressure of her pointed nails in the flesh of his palm. She rose hastily and walked towards the mantel. The sight of a wound or a scar always agitates and sickens me, she said. I shouldn't have looked at it. I beg your pardon, he entreated, following her. It never occurred to me that it might be repulsive. He stood close to her, and the effrontery in his eyes repelled the old vanishing self in her, yet drew all her awakening sensuousness. He saw enough in her face to impel him to take her hand and hold it, while he said his lingering good night. "Will you go to the races again?" he asked. "No," she said. "I've had enough of the races. I don't want to lose all the money I've won, and I've got to work when the weather is bright, instead of, yes, work, to be sure." "You promised to show me your work. What morning may I come up to your atelier? Tomorrow?" "No." "And day after?" "No, no." "Oh, please don't refuse me. I know something of such things. I might help you with a stray suggestion or two. Now, good night. Why don't you go after you have said good night?" "I don't like you," she went on in high, excited pitch, attempting to draw away her hand. She felt that her words lacked dignity and sincerity, and she knew that he felt it. "I'm sorry you don't like me. I'm sorry I offended you." "How have I offended you? What have I done? Can't you forgive me?" And he bent and pressed his lips upon her hand as if he wished nevermore to withdraw them. "Mr. Arobin," she complained, "I'm greatly upset by the excitement of the afternoon. I'm not myself. My manner must have misled you in some way. I wish you to go, please." She spoke in a monotonous, dull tone. He took his hat from the table and stood with eyes turned from her, looking into the dying fire. For a moment or two he kept an impressive silence. "Your manner has not misled me, Mrs. Pontellier," he said finally. "My own emotions have done that. I couldn't help it. When I'm near you, how can I help it? Don't think anything of it. Don't bother, please. And you see, I go when you command me. If you wish me to stay away, I shall do so. If you let me come back, you will let me come back." He cast one appealing glance at her, to which she made no response. I'll say Audubin's manner was so genuine that it often deceived even himself. Edna did not care or think whether it were genuine or not. When she was alone, she looked mechanically at the back of her hand, which he had kissed so warmly. Then she leaned her head down on the mantelpiece. She felt somewhat like a woman who in a moment of passion is betrayed into an act of infidelity and realizes the significance of the act without being wholly awakened from its glamour. The thought was passing vaguely through her mind. What would he think? She did not mean her husband. She was thinking of Robert Lebrun. Her husband seemed to her now like a person whom she had married without love as an excuse. She lit a candle and went up to her room. Alcée Robin was absolutely nothing to her. Yet his presence, his manners, the warmth of his glances, and above all, the touch of his lips upon her hand had acted like a narcotic upon her. She slept a languorous sleep, interwoven with vanishing dreams. Chapter 26. Alcée Arobin wrote Edna an elaborate note of apology, palpitant with sincerity. It embarrassed her, for in a cooler, quieter moment, it appeared to her absurd that she should have taken his action so seriously, so dramatically. She felt sure that the significance of the whole occurrence had lain in her own self-consciousness. If she ignored his note, it would give undue importance to a trivial affair. If she replied to it in a serious spirit, it would still leave in his mind the impression that she had in a susceptible moment yielded to his influence. After all, it was no great matter to have one's hand kissed. She was provoked at his having written the apology. She answered in as light and bantering a spirit as she fancied it deserved, and said she would be glad to have him look in upon her at work whenever he felt the inclination, and his business gave him the opportunity. He responded at once by presenting himself at her home with all his disarming naivete. And then there was scarcely a day which followed that she did not see him or was not reminded of him. He was prolific in pretext. His attitude became one of good-humored subservience and tacit adoration. He was ready at all times to submit to her moods, which were as often kind as they were cold. She grew accustomed to him. They became intimate and friendly by imperceptible degrees, and then by leaps. He sometimes talked in a way that astonished her at first, and brought the crimson into her face in a way that pleased her at last, appealing to the animalism that stirred impatiently within her. There was nothing which so quieted the turmoil of Edna's senses as a visit to Mademoiselle Reisz. It was then, in the presence of that personality which was offensive to her, that the woman, by her divine art, seemed to reach Edna's spirit and set it free. It was misty, with heavy, lowering atmosphere. One afternoon, when Edna climbed the stairs to the pianist's apartments under the roof, her clothes were dripping with moisture. She felt chilled and pinched as she entered the room. Mademoiselle was poking at a rusty stove that smoked a little and warmed the room indifferently. She was endeavoring to heat a pot of chocolate on the stove. The room looked cheerless and dingy to Edna as she entered. Sogol, a bust of Beethoven, covered with a hood of dust, scowled at her from the mantelpiece. "Ah, here comes the sunlight," exclaimed Mademoiselle, rising from her knees before the stove. "Now it will be warm and bright enough. I can let the fire alone." She closed the stove door with a bang, and approaching, assisted in removing Edna's dripping mackintosh.